Well, good morning, everyone. Happy day to y'all. Today, we're going to talk about the nature of the self, and that's self with a capital S, the real self, also known as the higher self, the Atma, the Christ within. All these different names are the same. We cannot perceive the self in any way, as perception takes place in the mind. And the mind is, although outside of time and space, still part of the illusion. If the self could be an object, who would be the knower of it as a subject? So is the self relegated to always being an unknown? No, it's just covered over by our ignorance and insistence that the way things are the only way things can be, and the way things are designed by God. Nothing could be further from the truth, but that seems to be blasphemy for most, as we were not taught this information growing up, and it sounds like heresy. The way things are not designed by God or of God. So once our ignorance is removed, it becomes apparent. The self becomes apparent and is as it has always been. But now we become aware of it. We cannot go out and find it somewhere else, or even go out and find it, for it does not reside in any of the places that we, the ego part of ourselves, would choose to look, nor does the ego really want us to discover it. It does everything it can to hide that aspect of ourselves. There are many different paths, with many, if not most, leading us further away from Source. For instance, and this is an example of something that's practical in our lives, yet very indicative belief-wise of who we are and what we do. If you have dirty windows and decide to clean them, should we focus in on the window or the dirt? You have 15 seconds to write your answer, and then ring the buzzer when you're ready. Many of us might answer that we should focus on the window. In other words, stay positive. Don't get mired or bogged down in all the dirt, aka the crap that exists out there. But it's not about positive or negative. It's about the truth and what hides us from the truth. So to answer the question, do we focus in on the window or the dirt? The answer is simple and obvious to those who know. It is the dirt we need to focus in on. Well, that's not being very perfect, we might think, or very positive. Yet the window will become clean by removing the dirt without ever having to fix the window. The window is, period. The dirt, once removed, allows us, the observer, to see clearly and observe without question. Another example would be a room full of junk. Do we get rid of the junk, or do we bring in more space? We have a bedroom, or we have a basement, or a garage, or a barn, and it's loaded with junk. So do we bring in more space into the room? No. Obviously, getting rid of the junk would be the only approach. Once removed, the space in the room reveals itself. Nothing needs to be done with the space. Only that which clutters it needs to be addressed. These examples are a microcosm of how we think about our lives, a microcosm of our philosophy. We need to address the obstacles in our lives in order to ultimately see, with vision, not just with the physical eyes. The self then, the real self, the higher self, Atma, Christ within, is love. This love is undetectable until we remove all the obstacles that cover it and keep it obscure. Descartes thought that thinking was fundamental to our being, and that the mere fact that we think is evidence of our existence. But rather than "I think, therefore I am," the phrase "I am" would have sufficed and been perfectly adequate. But this "I am," by the way, is not a point behind the eyes, it's not the third eye, it's not the heart center, as these are just coverings. They are representations or symbols of that which is. We're talking about the self here. When we experience something, anything, there are always three aspects to this process: the experiencer, the experienced, and the act of experiencing. So the subject, the object, and the predicate. So in awareness, there is that which is aware, that of which it is aware, and the act of being aware. Our real self is beyond all three. Now let's take a look at the nature of the self by looking at what is called the soul. There is usually confusion around what this word means, especially by the religions of the world, particularly Christianity. If fond of this word, we may think that the soul is what we are. We may think that the soul survives the death of the body and goes elsewhere, even to another body, when the time is right, as in reincarnation. Almost certainly we believed, or even after all that I have taught, believe still, that the soul is separate from other souls, unique to us, and certainly distinct from what we call God. We may believe that, but no longer should we. If the word soul is used as a synonym for the self, which has no individualized aspects, then of course it is an accurate understanding. But most of the time it means something else. The word is used in different ways by different people who themselves are not even certain what they mean. If the sense of ourself that we have is such that we associate ourself with the mind more than any other aspect of self, then we probably believe that the soul survives death and does so with the mind, that is, our memories and thoughts, coming along for the ride for the next lifetime. Otherwise, it would seem kind of silly to go from one lifetime to the next without our memories and thoughts. We wouldn't be us if we didn't take them along, right? Ramana Maharshi had a few interesting thoughts about this. He compares the real self with the sun, which is always shining, whether or not covered by clouds, and irrespective of the rotation of the earth. The self, too, is always shining, regardless of the rise and fall of the ego. The self always remains as is, even when the ego seemingly gets mighty and proud. But boy, is that an illusion that we have all bought into, that the ego can be mighty. It can be vicious, but never mighty. Now, another story that Ramana Maharshi used as an analogy was about the person who attended a wedding reception. The bridegroom's party assumed he was a guest of the brides, while the brides thought he was a guest of the bridegroom. So everyone made him welcome and assumed he had a right to be amongst them. After a while, when no one on either side recognized him, questions were asked and suspicions arose. The uninvited guest observed this happening, realized he was about to be exposed, and quickly left unnoticed. The uninvited guest is the ego. As long as everyone remained ignorant, the ego persisted, enjoying the fun while it lasted, yet fearing the worst because that's its philosophy. All while others believed him to be a real and legitimate guest. As soon as the others began asking questions, became wise, and were about to choose another option, it vanished. The ego left when faced with knowledge. Ramana Maharshi says that the ego is similar to the soul. They are both illusory concepts made up by man to explain the inexplicable. Neither the ego nor the soul define who we are, as we are only that which is, the real self, or the I am. So can we describe the self? The answer is mostly no. We can talk around it and figure out what it is not, but we cannot inform anyone of what it is. As I mentioned weeks ago with respect to Immanuel Kant's nominal and phenomenal worlds, we can never observe the self as an object. Therefore, we cannot describe its properties. There have been a few throughout history who have fully awakened and realized the self and have talked or wrote about it, and only in that way can we learn of it. But mostly, we learn what it is not. It is believed that words cannot describe the self, as words are symbols of symbols twice removed from reality. Ultimately, the language to describe the self is silence. which is why the Kena Upanishad states, the man that who claims that he knows nothing, but he who claims nothing knows. And as Lao Tse has said, he who speaks does not know. He who knows does not speak. Art, music, and poetry are used to convey truths about the self, but nothing can speak to it in a literal sense. Even David Hawkins, as eloquent as he was unable to convey the state of ineffableness, joy, and unimaginable bliss he experienced when he was in the presence of the self, the Atma, without any other attendant thoughts of interference. It is a state of pure bliss, unimaginable and indescribable. The universal self is called Brahma. In our language, we call it God. Atma, when I say the self, it's known as Atma, is identical to Brahma, since there are not two. But the distinction is made. We have two different names between these two, so that the unenlightened may be able to talk sensibly about the true nature of apparently separate individuals. But again, as you now know, there's no separate or individualized anything. So let me tell another story. This one is from the Mundaka Upanishad. Two birds with beautiful wings are constant companions, roosting in the same tree. One of the two enjoys the taste of berries. The other looks on, not eating. Sitting in the same tree, the personal self, heavy of heart, is deluded and powerless. But when he sees the other, his true self, he is freed from sorrow. So what is this saying? The bird enjoying the fruit is the ego, or jiva, identified with mind and body, and reliant upon material pleasures of life for fulfillment. But this also makes it equally vulnerable to the vicissitudes of bitter fruits. The fruits are the fruits of karma that come to us as the result of past actions. Basically, what it's saying is we move through life looking for scraps of momentary pleasure, finding both temporary pleasures but also plenty of misery. The bird that is merely witnessing is the real self, forever tranquil, in full knowledge of itself, indifferent to the pleasures of the fruits, and thus not concerned with the frequent but temporary pleasures and miseries. As long as we remain identified as mind and body, we continue to exist as the first bird, agitated, sometimes satisfied. But when these illusory attractions in our lives are renounced, we attain peace and establish our true nature. In the Brahma Sutras, a seeker asks the Guru 3 times to describe the nature of Atma, or the real self. 3 times the Guru remains silent. Finally, the Guru says to the frustrated student that he answered him, but the student does not understand. The answer is silence. When asked who we are, we give them all of our titles and roles. But silence is the answer. Silence is where peace resides. The divine resides in the silence because it is peaceful, not in the chit-chat. Silence is the Atma, or higher self. Its nature is beyond name and form and cannot be spoken of. It is awareness, beyond space and time. It can never be approached by the mind, nor ever explained. When the seekers asked the Buddha, upon him coming out of his meditative state of years and years and years, when they asked him about God, Buddha remained silent. His silence was his answer, but was mistaken as evidence that there must not be a God. So Buddhists traditionally do not believe there is a God. But the answer is silence, peace, God, as they are all the same, yet they cannot be conveyed verbally. Now the question may have come up in your ever-thinking minds, Why are things like this? How can it be that we are supposedly Satchidananda, or in a blissful state, and yet stumble through life believing ourselves to be the body-mind-intellect complex? Why are things so difficult if we are already perfect? Why do we have to vainly live our lives searching for occasional pleasures when we supposedly already have everything? Well, once you know it, there's another story I can tell that will hopefully get this point across. A man is walking through a forest and is robbed and shot with a poisoned arrow. Friends, fortunately, discover him quite quickly before the poison is able to take effect. Thus, he's able to explain what happened. They make ready to get the antidote, but he insists that they go after the robbers. After much discussion and insistence by the wounded man, in which his friends continually advise him that pursuing the robbers can wait, the poison takes effect and he takes his last breath. We too act in a similar way. We get involved in, are concerned with, and act upon the most meaningless stuff that detour us and detract us from the path. Not our ego path, but the spiritual path. We want to find out why we're in this situation, so we allow ourselves to get emotional, distraught perhaps, embittered, frustrated. We are basically deluded by that which does not matter, by Maya, the veil. We get caught up in the world, and we believe we are this body and this mind because, quite naturally, everybody else does, so why wouldn't we? We fail to listen to the quiet but consistent voice that is always offering guidance to us. The ego voice will always be louder. The spirit voice is always quieter, softer, calmer, never ever demanding. And we can't hear it. But ultimately, all is irrelevant. What matters is what we do now from this point forward to get ourselves back on track. At the same time, we need to learn to save the mundane questions that traveler who ultimately took his last breath was so concerned with, that we think are so important. We need to save them for later. Because once we realize the truth, finally realize the truth, neither the questions we have nor the answers we may receive matter. What we once thought so important becomes trivial as we gain knowledge. They lose their importance, as do the contents of any dream we have once we wake up. In the end, we are not a person. We are not a human being. In our ignorance, we mistakenly superimpose various concepts upon ourselves, such as, I am the body, the mind, the thoughts, the feelings. Definitely I'm the feelings I have. The behaviors, beliefs, my nationality, the profession I have, or the many professions I have, the gender I am, the roles I play. That's who I am. We superimpose these traits upon the reality of the self. Just as in the dark, we mistakenly superimpose the image of a snake onto a rope. It turned out to be incorrect. Bodies and minds, thoughts and feelings are only names and forms within the one undifferentiated reality. Thinking ourselves to be individuals, we believe we are significant, or at the least more important than someone else. But as one of the Upanishads tells us, all the joys of the entire cosmos put together would be only a small drop of the bliss of the Supreme Being. Whatever little satisfaction we have, whatever pleasures we have, whatever joys we are experiencing, whatever be the happiness of life, all this is but a reflection, a fractional reflection, a drop, as it were, from the ocean of the Absolute. And with that, enjoy your day, everyone. See you next time.